Hey guys, V. Rigoni, Max, high performance real estate entrepreneur. So what are we going to talk about today? Well, let's talk about the economy, how it's going to work with multifamily, and what the hell is going on. Before we do that, let's smash the like button, let's subscribe to the channel, and after you listen to this, leave some comments. It's nice to know what you're thinking, and I'm happy to be able to respond to them. What in the hell is going on? Right now, we've got a situation where they decided they weren't going to raise interest rates anymore. If you recall back, about a couple months back, I said it looked like the Federal Reserve was going to blink on raising interest rates. And why are they blinking? Well, they're telling you that they believe that the economy is starting to slow down, which it is, and that there's a lag from when you start to raise interest rates to where the economy ends up slowing down and starting to do that pullback to kind of start to break the inflation cycle. A lot of that's true. There's a lot going on, but there's a lot of bullshit out there too. And why do I know this? Because you see, I lived through this already. I lived through this in the 70s as a kid, and then as an adult in the 80s. And this stuff takes time to get through. This is a cycle based upon inflation. Now, we've got Jay Powell, and he's the head coach on this deal. He's the guy making the decisions. But is Jay Powell acting like Paul Volcker, or is he Arthur Burns of the 1970s? It looks like he's both. Isn't that crazy? And what do I mean by that? Well, Arthur Burns was in charge of the Federal Reserve in the 70s when inflation went out of control. I get it. There's a lot of controversy about whether or not the Federal Reserve should even exist and the central banking system. But let's just set that aside. Why do I say that? Because this is the reality we live in. It exists. And so we got to deal in this reality. Arthur Burns, he just sat there and watched inflation of the 1970s. And where did that inflation in the 1970s come from? Well, it came from a war called Vietnam. We had a much smaller economy, and it also came from the Great Society changes on welfare and all the reforms that came in. They were considered to be reforms, the social engineering of LBJ after the assassination of President Kennedy. What I mean by this is that you have Jay Powell raising the interest rates. He raised them 10 times in a year and a half. Now, I don't know that we've ever seen that kind of velocity in the rise of interest rates. And what is that going to mean to us? At the same time, he spent years in total denial of the inflation that was being created due to all the printing of $7 trillion, whatever your number is, 6, 7, throughout all of the pandemic, all the craziness that started. The printing really started, juicing up during Trump, and it went on overdrive during Biden, and all this money being flushed into the economy, just being pushed in, creating this kind of inflation. Up until January 1st of 2021, you had these guys talking about transitory inflation like it was going to go away. And then all of a sudden they wake up and they decide, oh, I guess we got some real inflation. And now we got to pound the interest rates up 10%, and let's really destroy that economy. This is a problem. Why is it a problem? Because investors, people like yourself, people that want to become investors, people who are investors, they have to deal in this economy, not from a consumer standpoint, but from an investment standpoint. And when things change so quickly, it creates disruption. If you're the one being disrupted all over on, you're kind of screwed. And we're going to talk about who's getting screwed in this deal. If you're ready to go and you're just starting out, you can take a look, you can sit back, you can see where are the opportunities, because in every disruption there's opportunities. They're there. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy. What I want you to understand is that when you are dealing with inflation, when you're dealing with a Federal Reserve that has decided that it wants to become punitive to inflation, it wants to control inflation, it wants to drive down inflation, they're going to do some things that are going to create all kinds of problems. We also found out that by raising these interest rates, they were destroying the long-term portfolios of treasury bond values that these banks were buying. They were borrowing the money short-term from the Federal Reserve and from large depositors. They were taking those funds, they were buying longer-term treasury bonds with short-term money. And so when the cost of that money went through the roof, those bonds lost a lot of value. So then they create this problem in the banking system where these guys all loaded up with these portfolios of bonds and mortgages. Remember the 2.5% mortgage? mortgage? Well, somebody owns those mortgages. Those are an investment to these banks. What do you think the value of that 2.5% mortgage, that paper, that mortgage, what do you think the value of that is when interest rates on mortgages are now at 6? The value of those portfolios of mortgages get destroyed. Is that all of a sudden the assets that were the underlying assets of all that are in all these banks, mostly the regional banks, but also the big ones, those assets were getting destroyed. Now, we've seen some of the deals that the Federal Reserve and the government has made with First Republic, with JP Morgan and all that, some sweetheart deals. You'd like to have your losses guaranteed too, wouldn't you? The Federal Reserve raises interest rates 10 times, brings it up to basically around 5% on the Fed fund rate, and then all of a sudden you have all these banks are in trouble. So you got the banks in trouble, you got all these other investors all of a sudden in trouble, and at the same time, they've only got inflation down to about 4%. If you talk to any economist, they will tell you that it's a lot easier to get inflation down to the point of 4 or 5% from 8 or 9 than it is to get it from 4 down to their target of 2. That last 50% drop is where it gets to be really, really tough. What's the Fed doing? Well, they had a blink on inflation because they were destroying the regional banking system. So we're sitting there. We've got a banking system in trouble. We got an economy that's slowing down. Now, how do we know that the economy is slowing down? Look at transportation. You know those container ships? They're down 40%. They've lost 40% on what they can charge to move those large containers overseas. Transportation in general, trucking fees, they're down huge. As transportation goes, so goes kind of the economy in a way. It's at least a indicator of where this is going. So is the Fed getting the economy to slow down? Absolutely. But did they wait way too long to do it? And maybe they've gone too hard? Well, we'll see. I heard recently there's something like 400 PhDs in economics and in everything else in the Federal Reserve. Way too many smart people doing stupid shit. They brought us this economy. What is this impact? How does it impact you on the street? If you've gone to buy a house, all those people that wanted to move out of New Jersey and go to Florida 2 years ago, they were moving out of New Jersey and New York and Chicago, moving to places like Florida and Texas, and they were buying houses. Yes, the prices were up, but they were buying houses at a 2.5%, 3.5% interest rate. Now, if they want to sell their house in New Jersey or in New York or in Chicago, or God forbid, San Francisco, and they want to move somewhere, now they got to pay 6 and 7% for the high-priced homes that are in Florida now, in Austin, in the places that these people want to go and live. So does that slow the real estate market down? Oh, absolutely. Have they seen it in the spring? Not as much. Why? Because there's been a lack of inventory. Because when interest rates rise as quickly as they have, people don't want to give up their 2.5% mortgage, so they don't put their house up for sale. And so it has been kind of an artificial bullish market in real estate as far as pricing, but not transaction. Transactions are down, both in single family and hugely in multifamily. There's going to be a price to pay for this. Let's talk about multifamily. Let's talk about how this is impacting the people that own apartment buildings, that are renting them out and trying to make a buck. Because when they're trying to make a buck, what else are they doing? Well, they're hiring people to fix up these apartment buildings. They're hiring people to manage these apartment buildings. They're providing housing for people who can't afford to buy a house. There's all kinds of social benefits from people who buy and invest in multifamily or single family to rent it out. How are they being impacted? What's happening to them right now, interest rates on a lot of mortgages, on these adjustable rate mortgage, are going through the roof. And how do I know that? I was there. I was at conferences 2 years ago, 3 years ago. I was sitting at a conference down in Florida on real estate. I'm sitting at the bar there. Because I always like to, you first go to the conference, you go to the bar, you get to talk to people, you meet some people, blah, blah, blah. The amount of people that were buying multifamily buildings of all sizes, from 6 units to 160 units, 300 units, what they were having to do was they were having to buy these buildings with adjustable rate mortgages. Why were they having to go for an adjustable rate mortgage? Who in their right mind wouldn't want to get a fixed rate mortgage on a commercial loan at 4%? And why weren't they doing that? Because one would think that would be the smart thing, One would have thought at that time, are they going to forever keep interest rates down? They've been keeping them down mostly since, 9/11. So one could start to think, well, maybe they are going to keep them down forever. And that was basically how they were proceeding, was based upon the fact that they thought that rates would stay down. And so what they were doing is they were buying these buildings with adjustable rate mortgage. And the reason they could not go to a fixed rate mortgage is because the underwriting of the building, when they would go to the apartment and then what they'd have to pay for that apartment building or that apartment complex, what they'd have to pay for it was so much money that it could not positively cash flow if they had a fixed rate mortgage. So they had to artificially get a mortgage that was lower. And what I mean by artificial is because an adjustable one day is at 2.5%, and the next day it could be at 5%. But they were there doing their underwriting. They were there looking to see if they would be able to own this property, make money on this property for themselves and their investors, and keep buying real estate. Well, again, prices of the real estate went up so high that they could not make the deal work with a fixed rate mortgage. So they went to adjust. So what the hell you think's going on now? These guys, are drowning. And everybody at this bar that I was at this conference that was on multifamily, they were all buying their properties based upon adjustable rate mortgage. On top of that, they were getting hard money to fix them up, because when you have multifamily, one of the theories regarding multifamily for investing in and bringing up the value is forced appreciation. And by forced appreciation, what we're talking about is you drive a lot of money into the building, you fix it up, especially while at a time when rents are going up, and you're able then to drive those rents to a higher number because you're now re-renovating the units and then getting more money for them. So what they were doing is buying the property with an adjustable rate mortgage to make the cash flow work. Then they're going out and getting short-term. There's the problem. Short-term, high interest rate mortgages to fix them up. And the shit is hitting the fan right now. Why? Because enough time is going by. Over the next 6 months, 10 months, 12 months, that's when you're going to really start to see the pain. If you had a mortgage that all of a sudden the interest rates went from 2.5%, 3% to 6 to 7, you think you're going to cash flow when you underwrote it at 2.5% or at 3%? And now you're sitting there with a mortgage where the interest rate has doubled? What the hell are you going to do? Now you're losing hundreds of thousands of dollars on larger complexes a month. On smaller buildings, it could be 10,000 or whatever the number is. I can tell you that based upon whatever the economics of those investors, they're suffering right now. They're suffering big time. Why? Because they got a building that's fully occupied. Everybody's paying the rent, and it's not enough money to pay the mortgage. That's insane. What's another component to this problem? Reserves. When you go and you buy a multifamily building and you go out and you get agency debt, Freddie Mac, the government lending you the money, they have the thing called reserves, where you're supposed to put up a certain amount of money in a bank account so that if there's a problem, you have money there to pay the mortgage. Everybody should have reserves whenever you're buying a building. I don't care if it's a single family home. You should have reserves. Some of these reserves have gone from $80,000 to $800,000 as an example. And then they're given 6 months to bring it up to $800,000 from 80. Whoa, that's some change you have to be laying around, isn't it? Especially at a time when all of a sudden your cash flow is compressed from being positive to being negative. Do you see what's happening in this scenario? This is the fallout. This is the disruption that's taking place. The building values will start to come down. Will they come down based upon a systematic reduction in valuations across the board? No, because real estate is local. What's going on in Florida is different than what's going on in Austin, which is different than what's going on in Chicago. There are trends. This is a trend, but local pressures can either increase the problem or lessen the problem. But there are some structural situations, right? The raising of the interest rates, all of a sudden going from a positive cash flow to a negative cash flow, having to increase the reserves. Where do you get that money? Now we have another problem that comes into play for people. Those guys that are out there right now with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of commercial loans that are going to have to refi these commercial loans this year. Because every year, hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of loans, they mature because most commercial loans are not out there for more than 10 years. So every year you've got all this money that's got to be refinanced. So what do you think is going to happen when you got to refinance all these hundreds of billions of dollars from 2%, 3% loans to 6, 7, and 8? You just had an asset that you've owned that has been quite profitable that now they're wanting you to put in more money into the deal in order for them to approve a loan based upon a doubling of the interest rate. Do you see where the disruption is? Because this is what's happening. This is a slow process. Everybody thinks that, oh yeah, I was listening to people, last in January, in December December of last year, January of this year, oh yeah, by the third quarter they're going to be cutting interest rates. Bullshit. They've got a problem with inflation, and inflation takes time to come down. Why are they saying this stuff? Well, because they didn't live through it. I lived through it in the 80s and in the 70s. The 70s was all about making money with inflation, through real estate, through gold, everything. Then the 80s hit, they raised those interest rates, shit hit the fan. It took us 4 years to get out of a recession that was created by the Federal Reserve. You think we're going to get out of this one in 6 months? Absolutely not. And there's other reasons that we'll talk about, from the fact that people have more access to credit cards than they did in the 80s. They have their IRAs and their 401ks to roll back on to maintain their lifestyle. Their wives, their spouses are making a higher rate of income. Women make a higher rate of income today than they did in the 80s, and more are in the workforce. All of those things that are there are what makes it harder and harder for the Federal Reserve to control inflation, because people have more money, and so they're not willing to slow down their lifestyle. They can offset their lifestyle through all those other means that they didn't have in the 1980s. This inflation problem is going to be a problem. This problem with multifamily is going to be a bigger problem. Is it dire? Well, not at the moment, but I guess it depends on if you're one of these guys that went out and put a real estate syndication together and you bought a $10 million building and you got a 2.5% interest rate and you did not get a cap on that adjustable. What I mean by a cap is that you could spend the extra money and put a 1% or a 2% cap, so the most your interest rate could go up was maybe 3.5% or 4%. If you didn't buy a cap, woe on you, because you are paying the price now. So there's going to be disruption. And when there's disruption, there's people going to lose money. But you got to know when it's time to go in and start to buy these assets. Is it time? Obviously not. Why? Because the activity around multifamily is literally down over 70%. And I've heard and read as much as 78% year over year. That's insane. But the prices of the buildings haven't just fallen yet. The stuff hasn't fallen yet. Why? Because people are holding on by their fingernails, because it hasn't been enough time yet. And unfortunately, in the end, they will end up in the abyss. But as time goes on, it will become an opportunity for you. They're the ones that were sitting there 2 years ago at that bar in Florida, in Orlando, talking about all the buildings they were buying, all the money they were borrowing to fix them up, the hard money loan. They're the ones that are out, yeah, this is what we're doing. What are you doing? I'm buying this, I'm buying that, paying the big price. They're going to pay the price now, because if you are responsible for the decisions you make in your life. Unfortunately, there's a lot of limited partners in these real estate syndications that are going to go down the drain their money with these people that were just in the business for a year, 2 years, 5 years, that the only part of real estate they ever saw was what took place after 2008. So they only saw good times. You got to try to make sure that whenever you're doing this kind of business, that you understand there is a cycle involved. And if you're going to come in the cycle towards the end of the cycle and keep buying, just hoping that the Federal Reserve keeps the interest rates at 2.5% on adjustable rate mortgages, well, you are going to pay the price, especially if you're not taking into consideration all the money, the trillions of dollars that they printed over the course of basically 18 to 24 months. If you sat there and you believed Jay Powell, if you sat there and you believed the White House with their crock of shit that we were in transitory inflation, and you sat there with a straight face and believed it, now that's some ignorant shit as far as I'm concerned. People might say, well, you're just looking at this from a 2020 view. We were buying stuff. I could have gone heavily into debt in our real estate syndications, in our real estate funds, but we didn't. We have very little debt. We went the opposite direction. We literally were paying cash for assets. And people were like, well, why don't you just throw that leverage on? Well, because we knew what was going on. We understood what was going on, but we were looking for assets that we felt were so undervalued that it was still a good opportunity. And then we made sure that we did it the right way. Now, people might say, well, why didn't you just get a fixed rate mortgage at the time? Okay. Well, because we knew that when this economy was going to break, when this inflation was going to break, you can't get foreclosed on if you don't have a mortgage. Nobody can take your property. No bank if you don't have a mortgage. Now, we have some debt, but it is slight compared to the asset valuation of our portfolio. Will there come a time? Yes. We're going to be looking over the next, anywhere between the next 6 to 18 months when we feel it's the right time. Then we're going to go up. This is what we're going to do. Then we're going to put debt on our portfolios, the ones that we've taken the appreciation on the valuations of the properties and basically doubled them. Ones where we've taken the rent from $900, $875 up to $1,500 a unit. And yes, we'll have a higher cap rate that we'll have to do, and they won't lend us quite as much money. I get all that, but then we'll put the debt on adjustable rate mortgage. Once the interest rates have peaked out, and we really believe at that point that the Federal Reserve is done raising interest rates, they've already raised it 10 times. Maybe they got 1 or 2 more times, they'll come back. Probably won't be much more than that because, you can only drive so many nails in the coffin. And by that time, who's ever in it is dead and never going to get out again. And I'm talking about the economy. So when those nails are fully in the coffin, that's when we'll go out and we'll put debt on this property because the storm clouds will start to slowly move away. The opportunities to buy properties at significant discounts will start to show themselves. And then we will start to move forward and put leverage and then use that leverage to buy more property. Okay, that's how we roll. That's what we've been doing. That's how we see this economy. That's how we see the multifamily real estate business, right? The opportunities will come, but it's real estate. I've told everybody, cycles in real estate are slow to move, slow to go up, slow to roll over, slow to go down. But once it's down, gives you plenty of time to walk in and buy the good assets. Why? Because everybody else, all the FOMOs, right? They all bought at the top of the market. They financed everything, leveraged to the hilt at the top of the freaking market due to FOMO. Why didn't we do it? Well, because we've been down this road before, people. Like I said, I grew up in the 70s. I was an adult in the 80s. I knew what was going to come.